Good morning. My name is Angel Nguyen Swift. I work at Enigma, as Flo mentioned, which is a data and technology company. I am neither, as you might imagine from my intro, a technologist, a data scientist, an engineer, nor do I really fully understand the detailed intricacies of how you all do your work. But hopefully by the end of this, you will understand why I think ice cream saves lives. I thank CARTO for inviting me to speak. I think that despite my sordid background, I hope that what I bring today is going to be what I find to be one of the most important things in finding truth in data, which is context. I hope that throughout the next 45 minutes or so of discussion, you too, by the end of this, will understand how ice cream saves lives. I thank you for allowing me to tell you about my story and my journey and how data has impacted my various careers. I do think that we share two things in common. One, a natural curiosity, and two, a passion to understand and to solve a problem, any problem. If I think about it, and I think about kind of how my passion started to form, I could probably go back to when I was a 5-year-old Vietnamese girl growing up in South Florida, working at my aunt's half Chinese, half Japanese restaurant. Spending a lot of time there and thinking about why I was spending all of my time at a restaurant surrounded by adults. I actually quite enjoyed it. And my job, my sole job, was to go around and ask everybody what their dessert order was. And back in the day, there was really a couple of options. We had ice cream. And the various options were chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, some combination thereof. So I spent many afternoons and evenings gallivanting through this restaurant, looking really cute at the time. I was 5, remember, very different than now. Really getting to know people through their ice cream orders. And that actually drew customers into the restaurant. They wanted to come, they wanted to see me, and they knew that I would remember their orders, and that was kind of the factor that really impressed people. Here I was this little 5-year-old girl, and I was actually remembering that Mr. Jerry Jones liked half chocolate and half vanilla ice cream, and we would bring it to them on a regular basis. Little did I know, what I was really doing was training my brain to how to profile, so to start to segment who liked what and what ice cream flavors were associated with what people. At some point, I started guessing people's ice cream flavors. And at some point, I would start getting it right. And if I got it wrong, no big whoop, right? I would just learn what their next ice cream flavor was and file that away in the little catalog. All of this manifested into a true passion to understand people. And that led me to my first career at the Manhattan DA's office. If I think about evidence, and if I think about crime, and I think about how I started looking at detail, really all it is a mindset. People are made up of various data points. But to understand the true context and the meaning of what those data points are, you needed to really put that together to tell a full story. And that really was the life of a prosecutor. It was a quest and a passion to find truth, to find evidence, to understand and unfold people's actions and behaviors, to understand whether or not actions and behaviors actually made up elements of a crime enough to prove elements beyond a reasonable doubt. As Flo mentioned, we were talking about my experience at the DA's office, and really, I will say hands down, and I tell anyone who's asked me for any career advice, because when they see my kind of bio, they scratch their heads and wonder how I ended up at a technology and data company. I tell them, working at the Manhattan DA's office will hands down absolutely be forever the best job I will ever have in my life. Making the decision to leave, go to American Express, and then explore additional opportunities such as Enigma was the best decision that I made in my life, because it allowed me to bring all the things that I've learned from the DA's office and put it in real world context. And really, at the end of the day, I think that's what we are all here to do. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's where the mindset of linking data sets together to tell truth is what we live for, passion and truth in data. So let's look at what the definition of evidence is and how this really truly connects with what I think data means. The available body of facts, so different data points or information, indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. So in the world of criminal law, you might think of something like this: putting together multiple actual real-world facts, right? You start asking people questions. Where were you? How old were you? What was the weather like? What was said? What did you see? But there was a lot more context that needed to be brought in to connect the dots, and you really needed to take a step back to fully understand why somebody in their minds thought that they needed to do something, right? If someone commits a crime, right, an element of every single crime, most, I should say, requires mens rea, an intent. What was somebody thinking? So again, going back to not only proving the elements of a crime, but what drives people to do what they do. If we look at the definition of data, facts and statistics collected together for reference or analysis. To me, that's a very similar definition of evidence. We're trying to pull together and think about what these facts are, and eventually pull all of this together for truth, setting, again, the mindset in place. When I thought about my career and preparing for speaking with you all today, I also thought about my transition from the DA's office to American Express. And people often ask, well, why would you leave a government job to go to American Express? Well, first and foremost, I doubled my salary, which isn't saying really that much, considering government positions really did not pay that much. And we're talking now back in 2001, I should mention, I did start the Manhattan DA's office September 4th of 2001. So it was an extremely eventful first week for me. It set in place a series of emotions and events that would occur over the next years of really what led me to my job at American Express in infiltrating companies to form true financial intelligence unit to detect terrorism financing and crimes within companies, and making sure that they stay corporate. Their corporate responsibility was something that was extremely important to me. But if I think about it, the Manhattan DA's office allowed me to be a user of a lot of data and start to create a mindset of understanding not just the outcome, but what made up that outcome. What are all the pieces? It's not just that somebody said something, but what was their condition? Were they lucid? Was it in the morning? Was it in the evening? All of these things matter when somebody says something. Because just because somebody says something doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It's up to you to pull all of these things together to determine whether or not that is ultimate truth. So what is it that about American Express that lured me over there other than what I had just mentioned? I had an opportunity to think about data in a different way. My predecessor at American Express basically said, one, you get to work with me. He worked with me at the Manhattan DA's office. And two, you are going to be able to form an investigations group that is focused on true intelligence and investigations, working with law enforcement, understanding what crimes look like in the real world, bringing in all of your experience as a prosecutor, and then trying to find crime that occurs within the company through credit cards, through prepaids, and looking at things from the opposite lens, which is through transactions, which is a very different way to look at evidence than at the DA's office. The DA's office, you go in, you kind of see the end result, and you kind of work backwards to try to understand how you got to that end result. At American Express, I was seeing kind of the opposite thing, right? We were seeing traces and pieces of evidence to try to get to what people were ultimately doing and get to that end result. But the key thing that was so important about the role at American Express was we needed to work with law enforcement to understand the context of what our data was telling us, what these transactions were telling us. Because in a silo, and if those of you who follow financial news, kind of think about the timing in your head. I started American Express in January of 2008. At the end, August, September of 2007, American Express made front pages, essentially, of Financial Times, because of violations of the Bank Secrecy Act and the USA Patriot Act for not having a substantial suspicious activity reporting process. So what that means is you didn't have a program in place to properly detect, investigate, and report suspicious activity. So we need to bring people in to understand how you can create this program in order to pull all of that together. And what was rampant in the private sector was that they weren't including people with real-world knowledge and real-world context. So just like any business, you think about a problem, you address that business. So anything that you build around that problem is very specific and siloed. People were not taking a step back to really, truly take to understand what the problem was they were solving and using data in just a data context versus a real-world context. And we see this because data generally is just data. I will also, and remember, I'm going to go back to my passion at the end of the day is always about people and understanding who they are, because without people, you don't have answers, you don't have knowledge, you don't have intelligence. Data is data is data. I mean, everybody here is garbage in, garbage out, but at the end of the day, the way you collect data determines, right, how that will be used down the line. So despite the fact that you always hear we have a wealth of data, there's always, we have data about almost anything. You can find data about almost anything. You can find information about almost anything, but it's disconnected. It lacks context, and it's oftentimes inaccessible. So even at a big company like American Express, you might imagine there's a wealth of information. That is so something that would happen to me, and I would be on the ground right now. So kudos to you for, good reflexes. Yes, I wish I had those reflexes. But in big companies, oftentimes the data is inaccessible, and in the real world, data is inaccessible. So even if you think about just the internet, right, and great companies like Google who have access to so much data, and many would argue way too much data, even back in the day, as they started to pioneer how to use that data, they had a huge epic fail. How many people remember Google Flu Trends? Right? What a great idea. I'm going to try to predict flu trends and beat the CDC's predictions by 2 weeks. That way, we can address health in different areas. We can help pharmaceutical companies. We can help, at the end of the day, people get better faster, or even try to prevent, right? But what was their biggest flaw? Their biggest flaw was they wanted to rely on search queries that they were collecting in order to help predict. And the problem with search queries is that that's all based on internet data. What is internet data? Well, we'll get to public data, but there's a difference between internet data and public data, right, and real world data. So the fact that they wanted to rely on data that people put into the internet for a particular purpose and apply that to things that were happening in the real world. And as much as some people don't want to admit it, those who are super involved in Second Life or are living in the world of Warcraft, they're two different worlds. And people react and live differently in those two different worlds. And to solve real-world problems, we need to understand real-world data. And we do have an amazing asset available to us for free, and that's public data. Lucky for me, I have been in a world where I was surrounded by government and had access to a lot of this data. And this is something that it's extremely important to understand the difference between how public data is collected and how internet data is collected, right? And it all comes down to what that data was being collected for. What was the purpose of this information being brought into this system, or being brought into this record, or being brought into this thing? With public data, it's being collected by governments, by cities, by nonprofits. Why? They're trying to understand what people are doing, who people are, how people are living. Think about your census data. Think about your taxes. This is information that is about people's lives and how people live. But the problem with public data and or government data is that it's extremely siloed and it was being collected for a very specific purpose with something in mind. When you think about how to pull all of that together, though, combining all of the different available public sets, you can start to understand how people live as a community and as a whole. Add that into what people are putting into the internet, understanding the context of why people are using the internet and what they're searching for and how they're acting on the internet. You have a world of data and knowledge and intelligence, more importantly, available at your fingertips. So I would probably not be doing my job now as an employee of Enigma if I didn't share with you Enigma Public. It was the premise that there was a wealth of data and knowledge that was untapped in this public data set that really drove the founders and the early engineers and data scientists at Enigma to create Enigma Public, which is one of the largest and broadest collections of public data. It's designed to connect people with real-world information so that you can find real-world answers. Whether or not you're interested in oil production, whether or not you're interested in H-1B visas, H-1A visas, J-2, J-1, whatever visas, how people are importing and exporting, all of these questions can be answered. But one of the things that Enigma Public doesn't do, and we're going to talk about down the line, and what it seeks to do is add additional context to what it is you're looking for your specific answers. What it does do is bring all of that information together into one place in a structured format. Don't ask me exactly how. I hear words like ontology management. I hear words like, putting things together in a graph database, and there's all sorts of, don't ask me about those technical questions, but what it does is centralize and normalize, in my mind, data so that you can then, in one shot, identify answers through all of these relevant and useful and, most importantly, contextual sources of real-life data. And it's there for public discovery, and it's free as long as it's non-commercial use, I have to say that, but truly has been a tool, and powerful tool at that, in thinking and helping the company and also public and other researchers think about how to leverage public data for making the world a better place. So I'm going to walk through a couple of examples of that. Smoke alarms. If we think about smoke alarms, most of us probably have one. But in November of 2014, there was a huge fire in the Broadmoor area of New Orleans that claimed the lives of 5 people, 3 of them children. So Enigma, in partnership with the city of New Orleans, got together and wanted to think about how to solve this problem and how to prevent this from happening using public data. They took, in this initiative, they began working on a model that looked at blocks and looked at within the New Orleans area, and identified areas likely to have smoke alarms and areas that were likely to not have smoke alarms, and compare that to data that told us what the fire fatality experiences were in the city. Based on the model and algorithm, we were able to predict whether or not certain areas who were prone to fire fatalities had smoke alarms. This allowed the City of New Orleans Fire Department to go out and knock door to door to confirm whether or not smoke alarms existed in these homes. In looking at the at-risk homes, they then distributed smoke alarms to the homes. Nearly a year later, another fire breaks out. 11 people, including a 2-month-old baby, were able to escape in the middle of the night. In place, in their home, was a New Orleans Fire Department issued smoke alarm based on this initiative. So that was the beginning of the project. In looking at the usefulness of that outcome, Enigma decided to partner with the American Red Cross in order to expand the purview of the algorithm in the project, looking at over 170 cities and covering every single block within those cities to understand at-risk homes. 25,000 people are killed or injured in 1 million fires a year. This was a cause that needed to be addressed through public data, with public data, by public data, and by the right technology and right contexts and right partnerships. So how did we do that? Like I said, lots of public data. If you look at US Census, there's the American Housing Survey, American Community Survey. The model was based on an understanding of, again, the most at-risk areas based on that location data. We looked at addresses across the world because at some point you need to pinpoint, right? You can look at areas and you can identify at-risk areas, but eventually you've got to get down to the specific homes and addresses that would be where somebody can actually go and knock on the door. So based on the multiple data sets, Enigma was able to partner again with the American Red Cross to bring together initiatives to place smoke alarms in at-risk areas. Gold smuggling. That's something that you may kind of scratch your head a little bit on and say, that actually still exists. People are actually still smuggling gold. In fact, I think when we did a study on gold smuggling, because it pertains to anti-money laundering, which again is one of my passions in trying to ensure that there's corporate responsibility to detect money laundering activity within financial institutions, people were very surprised that there's still this trade-based money laundering activity going on in the United States. So if you haven't heard, multiple news sources, including Bloomberg and the Miami Herald, broke a huge story that involved $3.6 billion worth of drug money being laundered through a very large, legitimate gold refinery in the US. So this is still happening in the US. There were 3 rogue, and I'm going to say rogue in quotes because I think it's still left to be determined whether or not the companies were in some ways complicit, either intentionally or through negligence, something that's still undergoing investigation today. But these 3 employees decided to use the infrastructure of this large corporation to take cash money from drugs, the main perpetrator himself calling himself one of the biggest drug lords through phone wiretaps. You could hear him kind of boasting to his friends, and taking money down to Peru. Taking cash into Peru, going to illegal gold mines, because the legitimate and legal gold mines require paperwork, they require a trail, they require applications, and they require accountability. And so he would go to, or they would go to illegal gold mines, and they would buy gold for cash, drug cash. And what does that mean? What are the implications of that? The implications are that we don't know the source of that gold. Because they're illegal, there are no controls in place to trace the gold, to test the gold. Are they up to standards? And that gold was being brought back into the US through forged documents, shell companies, and this trio of employees who thought they were going to make lots and lots of money. So this is eventually Peru. So you can see in the US there, the company that was named in this instance, ZNTR Metals, a very large corporate structure. So all of those little circles you see in the US, all US entities, all related to this very large gold refinery business, and where these 3 employees worked. And then you can kind of see how they operated, bringing the cash down into Peru initially, going to these illegal mines, and then giving the dirty cash to the miners and sending gold back into a legitimate system. Why is this so important? Well, if we think about illegal gold mines, we think about the people that work there. There are children, working under who knows what conditions. There are environmental implications. So because there are no controls, because people are in it to make a buck, and because illegal gold mines know that big cash money can be coming in from people who have connections to large corporations in America, they really could give a crap. So all sorts of environmental implications have been found here. Higher levels of mercury, which pollute the waters that are being consumed by the locals in the areas that these illegal gold mines exist in. Huge health concerns, environmental concerns. And if we think about the US, we've got small businesses who are being pulled into this fray, into this ring, right? Because these three people could not act alone, they would lure in local business people like this couple who then got indicted. They were owner of a pawn shop who would collect the drug money from local drug dealers and use their business structure to facilitate and carry the cash into, and help this trio carry the cash into Central and South America. At some point, Peru was under a lot of scrutiny. They strengthened their regulations and strengthened their controls around exporting gold in an effort to try to minimize the activity that was going on between the illegal gold mines and these nefarious, legitimate corporates. And you would see that based on the indictment, a lot of the activity from Peru ceased. So the trio went from Peru then to neighboring countries because they could no longer access the illegal gold mines in Peru and, more importantly, get the gold out. They started going to Ecuador. They started going to Colombia, Argentina. So how does all of this manifest in public data, and how does it manifest to tell companies what to think about and what to look for? Import and export records into the US and out of the US and in many of the countries are public. So we, in looking at this for the financial institution and precious metals community, started to introduce more knowledge to the companies so that they could better understand what the landscape was for import and export. What companies, what gold mines are registered? Which ones are legal? What countries are they from? How many employees do they have? How much are they importing and exporting? Because what value does that have to a company? They can then take that into their operational data sets and understand what's going on internally. Does the data that they see internally make sense? So in the case of our, self-proclaimed drug lords who were smuggling $3.6 billion worth of drug money into and out of the US, that company, in their company records, based on the indictment, so I have to preface that, again, indictment is also public record, they could see that at one point they were not receiving any gold from Peru, and then all of a sudden they were seeing a huge spike in imported gold from Peru. And right around the time that Peru decided to strengthen its controls, there was a huge decrease in the imports coming from Peru. And they started seeing imports from Ecuador and from Argentina and from Colombia. So internal company records play a huge role in this, but they need to be and must be informed by what's going on in the real world, because a company can only see what's going on in its transactions. But when combined with real world data, they become much more intelligent and knowledgeable. Human trafficking. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. When I first started working at the DA's office, I thought that I was going to, be a star prosecutor, as a sex crimes prosecutor, be on Law and Order one day, have like the dun-dun music, walking into courtroom, and really get these bad guys off the streets of New York City. As I learned more about sex crimes generally in the city, and then as I started to learn more about cybercrime, because a lot of the financial crimes happen through the internet, of course, especially these days, I realized that the problem was much, much, much bigger. And the problem was much, impacted a core human right, regardless of where you're from, regardless of what your culture is. Everyone has a human right to be you and be free and make decisions, whatever free means, right? Nobody has or has been asked to serve or enter into a world of slavery. Human trafficking really is a world, and human trafficking really is what we call today modern-day slavery. So thinking about that basic fundamental human right, I think about how we can combat human trafficking. Human trafficking, at the end of the day, is a business. So when you think about financial crimes and you think about financial institutions, they are at the core of what can make a difference in truly what I like to call getting people at their jugular, getting these huge systems and getting these huge businesses that are facilitating illegal laborers, facilitating sex slaves, facilitating really taking people forcibly, either physically or through coercion, into areas and putting them in impossible situations. How do we stop that? And we stop them at their cash flow. So if we think about organizations like Polaris, Liberty Asia, Mekong Club, Grace Farms Foundation, a lot of these nonprofit organizations are out there talking to people and bringing awareness around what human trafficking looks like. What does a recruiter look like? What does a victim of human trafficking look like? What are types of behaviors you can look for as a citizen, as a community? You think about, and the reason they're bringing this awareness is to make everybody think about about whether or not they're seeing it right in front of them. Remember the flight attendant, I forget which airline it was, that saw this child with an adult, and there was something that didn't quite seem right between the child and the adult. She ended up passing a note to the child and said, "If you need help, please come see me." And she was able to pull the child away from a real-time live human trafficker. So awareness is key in all of this. And so great organizations like the nonprofits I just mentioned and many, many, many more are really getting out there to bring awareness about real-world context and how these organizations work. So how do we take all of that real-world awareness and turn that into data and things that we can actually action from a data community and or, for me, financial institution community, because again, it's about cutting people where it hurts the most, and for these organizations, it's in the money. So it's taking all of this available data through organizations like Polaris, understanding what the vulnerabilities are and what human trafficking looks like. And in this instance, we're talking about agricultural slavery, slavery on farms, by the way, in the US, right? We're talking about H-2A visa applications, because these farms are applying for them, bringing in large amounts of laborers, putting them to work in crazy hours, giving them crazy hours, not feeding them any food, not giving them any medical attention, because again, at the end of the day, it's about production, giving them impossible goals to reach, and if they don't reach them, then they risk not working, and that means no money, and that means no access. By the way, when I say no money, I mean no access to your limited money, which I'm telling you, you owe me from when I brought you from whatever country you were from, and I paid for your transportation, and I'm paying for your living arrangements. So whatever pay wages they're earning from actually working on these farms is actually being taken away from them. So in understanding kind of what the human trafficking aspect or slavery looks like in agricultural and labor industries, we see that farms are employing contractors who are registered with the Department of Labor to bring in laborers from outside countries through the H-2A visa program. We see vulnerabilities in crops like strawberries, tomatoes, oranges, tobacco, and we look at how that translates to informing financial institutions how they can detect some of these things inside their own transactions. So looking at the long list on the right, to be tested in about 5 minutes, you can see all of the data points that financial institutions have today that can help detect and monitor for activity that may be indicative of human trafficking. You combine that with the list to the left, which are data points that are available via public record, and you could have, again, intelligence and knowledge that can point government and law enforcement into targeted investigations. So how does this play out? Again, non-tech, right? Non-engineering, non-data scientist. But because I'm here, we thought we'd plop a couple of data points into CARTO map related to the human trafficking information and data that Polaris gave us. So we look at the US and we look at the various farms that applied for H-2A visas. This is what we see. These are all of the agricultural industries, businesses that applied for H-2A visas, meaning they want to bring in laborers from outside of the US. And H-2A visas here with a limited time. So they're only supposed to be here for a very short period of time, and they're supposed to either leave to go back or their visas would get renewed. The darker the blue, the more applications were applied for. If we look at some of the industries that we talked about, strawberries, lots of dark blue there. Okay, we look, so this is strawberries, sorry. I'm getting old, so my eyesight is not great, but we start to see a lot of dark blue in some of the crops that were mentioned in the Polaris report. Apples, tomatoes, dairy and cattle, oranges. Does anyone notice any sort of a trend in where the dark blue H-2A visa applications were? Seeing some nods. If now, and you may or may not know this, but if you are a labor contractor, as I said before, you have to be registered with the Department of Labor in the US. If you do something bad, you violate a law, you violate a regulation, the Department of Labor has the right to debar you. So if you look at Debarment, and this is all public, these are all of the labor contractors who are listed on the Department of Labor department list. They're no longer allowed to facilitate, contract, bring in laborers, and apply for H-2A visas. Does anyone see a trend here? Now, if I tell you that based on Polaris's work with survivors of human trafficking in this area, many of them come from Mexico, Central America, you might see a trend and a pattern, which, by the way, is indicative of general money laundering, right? And if we think about the gold smuggling example too, this is what we call a lot of bad activity happening on border states, along border states. So when you combine all of the data together, this is what you see. If you hover over the dots and the squares and the circles, you can actually see the names. And why is this relevant? Well, Polaris, talking to real survivors, talking to some reformed recruiters even, right, have information and are sharing it about what's happening in the human trafficking business. How people are being moved, what's happening with them, how they're staying here, whether or not they are being given access to certain things. There are names, there are locations, there are addresses. Combine that with intel that law enforcement or financial institutions may have about these businesses, information that they don't have about the businesses, all relevant to giving law enforcement a full picture of where to target. I would argue that based on this map and based on this initial, very fundamental, simple combination of two data sets, combined with a lot of the intelligence that financial institutions and law enforcement can bring, there are some pretty fantastic leads here for people to investigate and look into to understand whether or not companies are being responsible. Now, I talked a lot about linking the data and pulling it all together and giving context and full picture and the importance of real-world context. I do not at all underestimate how difficult it is to do the data wrangling. It's crap. I mean, I can tell you that even at the DA's office, when we had a very small subset of data, and at American Express, where we had pretty controlled data, that trying to pull it all together and make sense of it and do something with it is really, really difficult. But the technology and the knowledge and the awareness is, quite frankly, better than it's ever been. We're no longer in the age of the Google Flutrons. People are smarter. You're coming to conferences like this. You're collaborating. The fact that I'm here and I have zero background in what you do day in and day out, I think speaks volumes about how important it is to bring context to the work that's being done. And so together, I'm a firm believer that collaboration is where we can really start to move the needle. Bringing awareness and understanding how and what the data is being used for, and ultimately, at the end of the day, understanding who and what is being done. Because data is just data, and technology is technology. But all of that is being created and used for humanity. So think back to the ice cream and ask people, what's your favorite flavor? And share yours. Because only then can we start to connect the dots, and only then can we start to understand context and find truth in everything that we're passionate about, which is answers. So ice cream saves lives. Hopefully you believe that too, because I know I'm going to get some ice cream after this. Thank you.